Whatto chaps, I'm MagicalMike and recently I've been playing Need For Speed Heat. This is the first entry in the franchise that I've played since Underground 2. Yes, that means I've missed Most Wanted and I should probably fix that at some point, but since Heat went on sale for literally £3, I picked it up on a fleeting whim and haven't regretted it. The DLC is super overpriced though, but I got it for free because it was part of the offer, so do be aware of that, and I cannot recommend one car for the prices that they ask for it. So DLC, no. Main game, yes. So, I wanted to talk about this strange mix of festival daytime sanctioned racing game and illegal nighttime street stuff, and if you're interested, like and subscribe, I've got plenty of content like this on the channel. Cheers. I didn't expect a lot out of Heat. I'd forgotten it even existed until it was on such a deep discount, so I gave it a go and ended up rather enjoying the arcade handling model much more than I had expected. Don't get me wrong, I like my fair share of realistic driving sims. The dirt rally games are my go-to, but I do like to indulge in arcade driving style as well, because they are fun. It's okay to like both, in case you actually needed to hear that piece of information. I found this to be a fairly easy game. There's a performance rating tagged on your car and on every event as a kind of suggested power level to enter the map, but I was able to consistently beat everything with underpowered cars. The only thing that I struggled with were the early police chases, which you'll outpower pretty quickly anyway. You don't even need to win every event. You can come in the top 4 or 5 and still get credit for them. And you can always turn the difficulty down if you want an easier time as well. The story here is nothing spectacular. I mean, do we really need anything more than a vague reason to race some cool cars? The game is set in a fake Florida-like city called Palm City, encompassing the city itself, the farmlands and the hills around it, a shipyard and dock area, a train depot, a quarry, a few interconnected islands via bridges, a mountain, and a whole lot of highways and mountain roads to blast around at high speeds. I quite like the world. There's a decent enough variety to the roads that make each area and improvised circuit feel like it has some character to it. While I can't remember many of the race names, I can still remember the general feel of perhaps about a dozen or so of them, which I think is pretty good. And the story itself is just a vehicle, ho ho ho, see what I did there? Very funny joke, to send us all around these race and event options. To sum up, there's a street racing ring that go out at night that involves our main characters, and the cops are real bad guys, like above and beyond evil for the sake of it, totally corrupt, awful people. They're tackling street racing hardcore and causing a lot of collateral damage in the process. So you spend your time in the day racing around legal, sanctioned events to win prize money, to upgrade your car or buy new ones, then to take them out at night to earn a reputation and make a name for yourself on the scene. And of course avoid the cops as best you can, while getting tangled up in things, finding a way to solve the crises and get rid of the dangerous guy in charge, Mr. Mercer. The licensed car list is pretty big here, with about 130 available, ranging from basic street cars like the Golf GTI and the Ford Focus to bangers like the Volvo 242 DL, muscle cars through the ages like the Dodge Charger or the Chevy Camaros, iconic drift cars like the RX-7, S2000 or the 350Z, and a ton of supercars as well, obviously. We're talking a ton of Porsches, the Pagani Huayra, a few McLarens and Ferraris, and of course a bunch of Lamborghinis. There's a really satisfying selection of cars to pick from here, and I'll bet that there's at least something on the list that sounds like it'll be fun to drive for just about anyone. Personally, there's loads there for me. While I don't care much for most of the bloated number of BMWs and Porsches littering the garage, I do appreciate that there's loads of choices like the Testarossa, the F40, the 2 NSXs, a 69 Mustang Boss, a bunch of rally cars, and a bunch of hot hatchbacks too. My stupid 2000s Honda Civic with a V8 slammed in the front is very silly, but enjoyable to race with, and my hot pink MX-5 is a time trial beast as well. I'd say the biggest draw of the NFS games is the car customization, and there's a mixed bag here. Some cars are heavily limited in what you can change about them, but others have ludicrously stylistic choices that you can make for bombastic appearances. Each car has a rating out of 10 in how much you can actually do visually, and none of that affects its driving performance, but it can be disappointing when all the 911s look pretty much the same and you can't really do a lot to them. You can change all sorts from front and rear bumpers, front and rear lights, spoilers, side skirts, roof scoops, window tint, front and rear rims, brake calipers and discs, fenders, full body kits, and there's tons of decals to add and mess about with too. So when the customization is there on a car, it goes hard. The community wraps are a huge star of the show though. There's loads you can do to customize your own and make them unique and then share them online. I'd spend way too much time on these, and I'm not very original either, so I often found exactly what I wanted already done by the community. A Tommy Mackinnon rally wrap for the Evo 10, a Richard Burns Impreza, a Martini E30 M3, how about a JDM NSX, Rallycross inspired Honda Civics, rad looking Japanese drift wraps, a bunch of Fast and Furious sets, particularly Suki's S2000, love this thing. Basically, the system allows for a ton of creativity, and with the community being able to share what they've already made, the sky really is the limit. I even made my own Bluesmobile out of the '69 Charger, which isn't a Dodge Monaco like the film, but it's close enough and still looks like a rust bucket, which was fun to drive 106 miles in the dark with sunglasses on. Then of course there's actual performance upgrades. As you play, you'll unlock more cars to buy from the lot, and the ability to buy increasingly more powerful engine parts. Ultimately, these don't vastly alter a car's personality, they just make you accelerate faster, improve your top speed, increase your cornering potential and your brake effectiveness, and that's kind of it. Swapping from a fat single turbo to a dual turbo setup isn't going to feel any different. You'll still feel like you're driving the same car. Slapping one of the various superchargers in the engine bay instead also isn't going to change that much. However, they are considered inferior performance in most cases, which is quite the wasted potential if you ask me. Nobody really wants to put a turbo in a Mustang, for example, but it is almost always the optimal choice, if you care about that stuff. Unless you're making a drift car as well, because superchargers are typically better in the acceleration department. It does change the sound of a car though, and that is pretty important, because those turbo flutters and dump valves are cool to hear. There's actually a lot of satisfying sound in the game, and while a lot of the engines may sound similar, there is a good variety of things to hear. The big single turbo sounds gruff as hell, while the duals sound a little bit more refined. The superchargers sound like they're preparing for takeoff. The exhaust pops are even customizable, but a little bit silly, and I enjoy the hybrid engines too, and in particular hearing all of the clunky chunky gear changes and how mechanical they are is really good stuff. Tyres and suspension are about the only important handling parts that you'll notice changing the feel of a car. There's a whole bunch of options to pick from, and a little graph on the side that shows how the car will be balanced, road versus off-road grip, and drift versus race style handling. Most of these options won't matter, you pretty much just use race tyres for racing and off-road for rallying, and strangely drag tyres for drifting. It turns out drag tyres are just the easiest to use when you want the car to initiate and hold a lengthy drift, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but go ahead and test the showcase and drift tyres against them if you like. This is a bit of a car hack, this tip. Oh, and also do remember to turn off the traction control if you want to drift, because that's a thing you can do, and it makes a big difference, it turns out. You can also engine swap in this game. There's optimal choices here too, but if you just care to make a cool sounding car, then any choice is going to be fine. And if you're just playing single player, then you'll be okay with just about any choice here too. My Ford GT uses the stock V6 because that's what they ran at Le Mans. I've still beaten players online with it and various other less than perfect engine swaps, but you can always look up recommended builds if you're unsure, but do expect a lot of V8 recommendations though. I'll put a link to a spreadsheet in the description in case you're interested. And then there's NOS, I suppose. The big tanks are really fun to use and give you that intense speed feel, but they can only be used when they're totally full and they go until they're empty. and hardly any races actually give you that much straight road to use them with properly. And these small booster shots are just kinda used to exit corners with. There's a little bit of strategy I suppose, but they don't feel all that impactful in the moment. And the AI sure isn't hard enough to warrant needing them either. Most cars in this game don't really feel all that different from each other. I love collecting cars since the original Gran Turismo, and do it in any game that I can, so I have a pretty solid garage in Heat, but most of these cars feel so similar that it's just a visual difference in most cases. It's fun to drive a sleeper Volvo or a McLaren F1, but both are going to win the races anyway when they're upgraded. I just enjoy collecting, earning some cash and driving some fun stuff on repeat. What it all comes down to is how well a car can drift and hold its speed through corners. I spent a lot of time driving racing lines like a grip driver, and while it's still beatable and fun, the real speed you need can be found in nailing drifts, and that's going to be the biggest sticking point for most players. Do you want to drift? Do you like that sort of handling? Or would you prefer not to? I wasn't initially too sold on the driving, with starter cars being very slow and having little to no personality, but as I got more parts and upgraded to see some speed, the game became a whole lot more fun towards the mid-game. There's also a menu called Live Tuning that you can use while driving any car that saves to any single car also, that allows you to fiddle with steering sensitivity, traction control and downforce, and swap between brake and throttle to drift. I'm not really keen on the brakes initiating a drift, but that seems to be the default, so I always swap that to throttle, and that's pretty important to know that that's an option too. In case you feel like every car is weirdly handling, that might be the thing that makes the difference. Some cars respond better to some settings, and it's a lot of personal preference too, but know that cars that don't feel right at first can usually be fixed with this menu. I ended up enjoying the mix of drift and grip handling models, so I just mixed my styles up whenever using the live tuning. Rallying of course made sense with drifting, but the NSX or my Audi R8 for example did not. I should also make mention of one car that is considered vastly overpowered by the community though, and this is the RSR. It's a wonderfully easy thing to drive and it goes like the clappers. It is heckin' quick. I also just love the stupid big wing that you can put on it. It is a 70s 911, so it does still have a ton of style about it. It's basically easy mode if you want it. I just thought I'd make mention of it since the community does like to bring it up, but I mean it's up to you if you want to use it or not, so it's not really a big issue, unless you want to make it one. Anyway, daytime events are all about making cash. There is no cockpit cam in the game, but I think it'd be pretty hard to drive with it at 200 miles per hour anyway, especially with traffic. There is no traffic during the day events, so you can focus on the track though. There's races, time trials, drift events, which I quite enjoyed in the Viper for example, and a bunch of open world collectibles to find. There's flamingo signs to hit, drift zones, speed traps which I found quite tough in a couple of cases, street art to collect and billboard jumps to smash. Basically there's a bunch of stuff to keep you interested in the open world, and I found it quite a relaxed collectathon overall. I'd say the game feels a bit like a Forza Horizon Lite, with how destructible most objects are and how damage only really matters at night. It does make things feel pretty chill and breezy. You'll still lose tons of speed by hitting things of course, especially barriers, but it feels much less punishing than it could be in something more serious. There's story quests peppered around, and the game does seem to end on a rather abrupt note with the idea that perhaps there was going to be more post-game content, updates that never happened, so we get left off with a bunch of phone calls to wrap things up eventually. Dialogue, story and the music were all just kind of fine for me, I suppose, but there were some funny moments like a guy bum dialing you, and during story races rivals like to trash talk you and it comes across really silly when they're hundreds of yards behind you and claiming they're still going to beat you somehow. But overall there's nothing too special to talk about here. And of course I should talk about the nighttime stuff too. Night is when the police will actively start coming after you, and they will send everything they have. It is brutal to start out with a slow car. You do events, you build up rep points and a heat level, and have to make it back to a safe house to bank it all. The more heat you have, the bigger the multiplier, and also the tougher the cops will be to avoid. It is quite punishing to not make it back to a safe house though. If you make a bunch of rep and then get busted or break your car, you lose about 95% of it. So do make sure that you're driving within your limits here. And these cops are relentless. They are insanely aggressive and extremely hard to lose without knowing some tricks. There's some places that you will learn eventually are easy ways to do so at, like jumps over water or rooftops that you can park on, but until you have a car that can even make it to those spots or across those jumps, expect to have a harder time. You'll hear the radio chatter to help you identify the hazards that are coming after you, like spike traps or roadblocks, faster Corvettes, interceptors, helicopters, rhinos that are there to ram you head on, and engine kill switches too, which are pretty easy to deal with. You just ram into the side of the car that's trying to trigger it on you. Most of this stuff is easy to swerve out of the way of, but damage will start to add up quickly, so do be careful. Nighttime is intense and good fun to play in. There is traffic in nighttime races too, but once you max your rep, there's basically no point in continuing to do those nighttime races anymore. Which is a bit of a shame because the game looks way cooler at night in my opinion, with all the silly neon underglow that we like to add to all of our cars, and the city lights and standing water reflections in the road. At least you can still get some cool shots from the photo mode if you're in nighttime. You can also unlock higher tier parts from the special high heat races at night, so there's a little bit of endgame content to do there. These are risky, but the Ultimate and Ultimate Plus parts are worth getting, and by that point you'll have super fast cars to drive, and the cops become much easier to avoid. You'll even lose them by just continuing to race as you would normally. So yeah, they do tend to lose their threat and relevancy, but it won't stop them from surprising you every now and then and ending your night early occasionally. But once you have unlocked those high tier parts doing those races, there really is nothing left for you at night time. I should also mention traffic, because that's kind of a dividing thing in racing games. I think it presents a rather unique problem to solve in all sorts of ways. Obviously, hitting them will slow you down and potentially lose your positions in a race, but it also causes damage and lets the cops catch up to you too. Initially, I didn't much like the traffic being such an obstacle, but as I played more and more, I began to appreciate that it makes cornering much more dynamic, as lines shift and gaps between those cars open up and close down. I just think it made the racing a bit more interesting in that way. And there's so many more details that I could talk about, like how once your cars get pretty decent, then you'll hardly play any city events because the cash payouts are too small in that area and the power level isn't quite high enough to present a challenge. I could talk about how a lot of the endgame circuits are just high-speed, straight-line highway rides, which don't pose much of a challenge either. I could focus on the more mountain-based races that have wonderful flowing roads to glide around, or the quarry having some great off-road opportunities, or how the golf course drift zone is so satisfying to drive around. But I think you've probably got a good idea of the game by now. So I think that's about it then. Cheers for watching.
Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's tough.